So the social worker work spans a lot of fields. For me specifically, I deal with children who have been trafficked from the Volta Lake, and so I'm going to focus basically on that. As part of our work, we engage in pre-operational planning towards the rescue of the children, and then during the operation, we ensure that we are there to make sure that all decisions taken are in the best interest of the child. And then after the operation, we sort of become caretakers of the children up until they are reintegrated with their original families. And so we are there from before the operation begins, and then all throughout the operation, and then after the operation, we seek a place for them to be placed temporarily before they are finally reintegrated with their parents. Even after reintegration, we monitor them for 2 years to ensure that their restoration is sustained, and then we can sort of let go of the case.
Right.
Yes.
Sounds like a very thorough and engaging job. And we will focus more on what happens after. But I want us to touch briefly on what you do before and during these operations, because it's fascinating to learn that you play a role even before the children are retrieved.
Yes.
What is that role? What do you do? How do you contribute to that, to the operation?
Okay. During the pre-operational field, so for instance, the police gets a tip-off or gather intelligence of trafficked children on the lake. They inform the Department of Social Welfare, and then they also inform us from IGM, so we offer support, manpower, and then logistics. And then we plan towards the children's well-being. We ensure that during the pre-operational planning, it's sort of like a multidisciplinary meeting between the police and then the Department of Social Welfare. And we ensure that every plan taken into the actual rescue operation is child-friendly. For instance, how the children will be taken away from the community, how to be put in a vehicle, how the movement from the community onto a processing center where the child would be interviewed. We'll speak into all of that and make sure that it's all child-friendly. So that's mainly the role we play before the operation. Also, we help to seek temporary accommodation for the children at residential homes, so that as soon as the child is rescued, he or she won't be stranded.
Right.
It will have somewhere to lodge for the time being while the family is being traced towards the child's reunification with the family. So that's what we do at the pre-operational phase.
So, is it possible for things to go wrong during an operation? Are there wrong ways of handling the children while rescuing them that could also have a negative impact on them?
Yes. If the operation is not child-friendly, it is likely that the children will be re-traumatized. So often, children who have been trafficked or have worked as slaves or servants on the lake go through a lot of trauma, emotional, physical trauma as well. And so it is good to plan well so that in rescuing the child out of that situation, you don't shoot yourself in the foot and take the child through further trauma. So yes, things could go south if plans are not put in place and the attention of people who are going on the rescue is not drawn to the fact that they need to treat the children as children.
Right.
It's easy for you to forget that they are children. Yeah. So they would need to be treated as children, and then they would have to be handled with care during the operation.
So on this occasion, for example, when we arrived at the premises where the children were being kept, they were asleep. They would have woken up to see big burly men with guns. Now, this is not the first time such an operation has been done. So what goes through the mind of a child when they wake up in the middle of the night to be surrounded with men who are there to rescue them?
So it's often scary. Some of these children were taken away from their parents by trusted adults, people that they were handed over to by their parents. And then maybe sometimes they were promised a good life, and then they come there and it's a terrible, terrible life. So for them to wake up in the middle of the night and see total strangers, it would be very, very scary. So we try as much as possible to have easy-looking people. So if the police are involved, police that are not carrying guns, that are not armed, and who are maybe in plain clothes, so that the children won't get scared when they see the people coming to rescue them. And then at rescue, we reassure the children that no harm will come to them, that they are in safe hands.
Right.
It is difficult for them to believe at the time for obvious reasons, but then with time and with care, trauma-informed care, they get to hope again and then trust again.
One of the children actually bolted. He ran off when we arrived. He must have been very confused.
Yes. That's a typical state of how the children feel. So that's a visual explanation or visual representation of how they feel at the rescue. Yes.
Right. So now let's look at what happens afterwards. These children are picked up from an environment which is horrible but at least familiar. Now they are brought to a processing center, and you have a number of them scattered across the place. So you take them to a processing center, and then what happens? First of all, what state are they in when they arrive there?
So at the processing center, they are disoriented. So they went to bed in one location, probably woke up and saw these people around, and then they came alive in another location. So they are very disoriented. And we allow time for them to settle in, for them to get used to their environment, and then we initiate the initial intake assessment. So it's an assessment to ask the children questions. I wouldn't want to call it an interview, but it's something like that, to ask them questions so that they can tell their own story. And then from there we can know, for instance, where they come from, which would help with family tracing and then future reintegration. And then we would know their current pressing needs, so that it would inform our decision to either place them at a temporary shelter while looking for their family, or the way forward generally. So the social workers' role there is to ensure that the interview process is child-friendly again, so that the questions don't traumatize the child. So some of these children have faced sexual abuse. So for such a child, asking certain questions can trigger the trauma. And so we are there to ensure that all questions asked by all parties, including the police, are child-friendly and also in the best interest of the child. And I must say that all initial intake assessments that I have been a part of, the police and then the Department of Social Welfare, social workers from the DSW, have done an excellent job at being child-friendly, yes, and asking child-friendly questions, yes, so that the children are not re-traumatized.
Now, again, to the specific example of the rescue that I participated in, the oldest child, a girl, would not stop crying. In fact, she only stopped crying long enough to explain to social workers that she was worried about the wife of the boatmaster. You know, and in fact, it was the wife who was supervising her work while she was with them. So, so basically, she was worried about her oppressor, if you will. Is that normal?
Yes, it's normal. So some of these children are trafficked at a very young age. I know of a boy who calls his boatmaster Dada, because that's the only father he's known. So if you've been in a situation of oppression for so long, regardless of what pain you went through, you sort of look forward to the approval of your oppressor. It's sort of like a twisted psychology kind of thing. And so you look forward to the well-being, or you look up to your oppressor even though he's treating or she's treating you poorly. And you just want the good of the oppressor, just so he would treat you well, sort of. So it's normal that the girl would be crying because of her oppressor. Maybe in her young state or her young mind, she doesn't know where she was, and the fact that where she was not good for her. That is all she's probably known all her life. And so it's very normal for her to be crying and not wanting to leave that place. It is very, very normal. So this is all they've known until they get a foretaste of a better life. Then they realize that they deserved better. Yes.
Wow. I was reading a bit about it. This is what they call Stockholm Syndrome, isn't it? You know, and you start to be attached to your captor, and actually want their welfare and defend them.
Exactly.
Fascinating. Okay, so then you have to fix this. you have to, basically treat this, if you will. How do you go about it?
So after rescue and then after the initial intake assessment, say a child has to be placed temporarily at a shelter while we trace the parents. We go to court and then seek a care order, so an order from a judge to place the child at a care home, and while we seek the parents of the child. So while the child,
we have a lot of these care homes. How do you find them?
So the care homes are sparsely distributed, but they are generally down south, and we find them through the help of the Department of Social Welfare. So the Department of Social Welfare oversees these care homes, ensures that they are running right, that they are obeying regulations, and that the ratio of child to caregiver is proportionate, so that the care homes won't be overburdened. So
these are regular homes where the home owner has decided to give care to children, or
no?
What?
They are institutions set up specifically for vulnerable children.
Right. Yes. So these are state-run.
Some of them are state-run. So the Department of Social Welfare has some care homes for children or vulnerable people, and then some of them are private institutions as well.
Do you know how many state-run?
No, I
care
can't
homes
tell. I won't be able to speak into that. Yes.
Okay.
And so when we place the children in these care homes, and then we seek a care order to sort of cover the children's stay at the shelter, we hand them over to caregivers at the shelter. So there are social workers at the shelter who also take care of the children there. And then we begin to plan a treatment plan, a care plan for the children to cover their care from placement at the shelter all the way until they are reintegrated. And the care plan looks at their educational needs, their psychological needs, their physical needs, every need that the child mentions during a needs assessment. So a needs assessment is an assessment we have with the child to ask him. It's more detailed than the initial intake assessment, to ask him or her what his goals and aspirations are, and what plans he or she has for his or her future, and how we can help with that. So after the child is placed at the shelter, then we begin to trace the family, because the child can't stay in an institution for long. It is not in the child's best interest to be away from the family. The child ought to grow in the family unit. So we would have to trace the family and then assess the homes. If we find that the home is safe, and we mean safe holistically, not just physically, not just security-wise. So are these the parents who trafficked the child? Do they know about trafficking? Are they remorseful? Are they likely to traffic the child again?
How are you able to assess that?
So we have an in-depth home assessment form that we use. The Department of Social Welfare also has many forms for case management. So it informs what questions we should ask the family. So we ask questions based on education. So what are their plans for the child's education, or generally what plans do they have for these children? And then based on the answers, we determine whether or not the child is safe to return to this home before we return the child to the home.
I want to ask this, how accurate are these assessments? Or let me put it another way. Are there instances when you return a child, after going through these assessments, you return a child to their home and they get re-trafficked?
So, personally, I haven't experienced a child that has been re-trafficked after a home assessment, but it is not far-fetched. Sometimes you go to the family and they lie. They blatantly lie. So we have to do multiple home assessments, and then the stories keep changing. Then we ask them, but you said this the last time, to ensure that they give us the truth as much as we can get out of them.
Right.
And then we let them know that if they tell a lie, it will come back to hit them, because, for instance, you ask them, how's your economic well-being? How well is your business? And they say, oh, things are well, because they want the child to return. And then 2 months down the line, 4 months down the line, they're like, I ran out of stock, I don't have money, and the child has to go back to the lake. But we asked you if you needed any help, and you said no, because you probably wanted the child back. So from my personal experience, I haven't had an experience with a child being re-trafficked, but yes, I'm sure it happens that way, and then would have to go search for the child. So that's why we do monitoring 2 years even after reintegration, after the child has been sent back to his family, to ensure that whatever plans the family said they had for the child, the words are consistent with the actions that they are caring for the child, and the child is in good health or is going to school or whatever they said they wanted to do for the child.
Right. So, tell us, have you ever encountered a family that doesn't want the child back?
I have heard of a story of a child who was rescued with other children, whose families were invited to come for the children. So the families were invited, they were asked questions, and they all said they wanted the children back. And all these children were sent to a neutral point where they were to meet their family. And they were all excited, and every other child's parents came, and that boy's parents did not come.
Oh gosh.
It was heartbreaking. My colleague that shared the story, so she had been in IGM longer than I joined, longer than I have been, and when she shared it, she wept. It was heartbreaking. So this child, it's sort of like everybody's mother or father is here, and I am the only one who is sort of not deserving of love, and so he had to be taken back to the care home, and then we applied for a longer stay for him. So his care order was extended so that he can stay longer at the shelter. Obviously, the family didn't have good reason for not showing up. They just didn't show up. Many families are nonchalant. What they wanted was money for the child to work on the lake, from the boatmaster while the child works on the lake. And once that money stops coming, sometimes they just don't care anymore.
What would you say is the most difficult part of your job?
Keeping my emotions in. That would be the most difficult, and trying to dissociate my personal feelings from my professional work, because it is hearing the children's stories is really saddening, and keeping a strong composure is really, really tough. And of course, professionally, I won't be able to do all, and I can empathize with them. They should be able to tell from my face that I understand them. But some of the stories are really, really sad, and it is difficult not to say, oh my God, you must have gone through this. Apart from that one, I think that one thing that is really difficult, that doesn't help, is the lack of resource for the Department of Social Welfare. So they really do a good job. They are a bunch of hard-working, relentless professionals who will stop at nothing to seek justice for the vulnerable, not only children. And they have a huge workload. They work on too many things, and their resources are really, really limited. It would be good to increase their resources, to give them more money, say, to, for instance, foot their transportation bill for home assessment, because for home monitoring, because if you don't monitor these cases, like you said, the child is likely to be re-trafficked. So it would be good to have vehicles for them for transportation, to refurbish their buildings and then put them in a good state, and just to encourage them to continue to do the good work they're doing, because they do really, really good work.
Wow. What's the worst story that you've ever encountered? Just the most miserable situation you've ever been in as a social worker?
There are quite a number of them. So maybe I'll pick this one. He was let's call him Benedict.
Okay.
So Benedict was in JSS 3. He was about to write his BC, and his father took him away before he could write his BC, and then gave him off to a middleman who trafficked him to a boatmaster. And he started working on the lake. So the average child rescued from the lake does these things: paddles the boat, scoops water from the canoe. So water seeps into the canoe or the boat because it's not strong, and you have to keep scooping water back into the lake. Casting and drawing the nets, managing the outboard motor, and diving into the lake. A typical day in the life of a trafficked child is going on the lake twice, sometimes as early as 2 a.m. and then in the evening. So they set the traps in the night and then they go back early at dawn to go and draw the net. And so Benedict was trafficked, and he lived with his boatmaster, went through all these things, paddling, etc. every day. He didn't go to school, obviously. And his boatmaster beat him into submission. So he wasn't just a student, so he was an older child. And many adults are unable to care for adolescents, so they don't know how to handle adolescents, much less adolescents in slavery. So they will beat you into submission.
Oh my God.
And this may be a little graphic, so for your listeners, sorry if it sounds graphic, but one of the things that the boatmaster used to do with Benedict was to tag at his penis when he does something wrong. So he kept tagging at it and pulling it, and while doing it, telling him that you will never have children. So that was his punishment, and he does that until he's tired, until the boatmaster is tired, and then he stops. He also beats him with a paddle or bamboo sticks or ropes. You can imagine being wet from diving into the lake and being cold at dawn and being beaten with ropes for doing something wrong, or going into the lake and because you ran out of air, you couldn't untangle the net from the tree stumps in the lake. So Benedict went through a lot of trauma, a lot of mental trauma, and he had physical scars all over his body from the beatings he had from his boatmaster. Thankfully, he was rescued. He's been placed at a shelter, and he's doing well by God's grace. And so that's probably not the worst, but that's one of the really bad cases that I have.
It's horrifying.
Yeah,
it really is. So I want us to look to the future. IJM is doing a lot in this space, and you're supporting the state institutions, but you've pointed out the difficulties and the limitations to their resources. So I want to know, according to some reports, there are an estimated 20,000 of these children currently living in slavery on the Volta Lake alone. Is this a solvable problem? Is this something that we can fix?
Yes, I think it is solvable. I think that reformation begins with our minds. People think that these children are learning a vocation, that they are in apprenticeship. And why are we trying to change tradition or culture? So my simple question is, these boatmasters have children of their own. If it is to continue the family business, why not hand over to your own child?
Yeah.
And if you go for another child and use that child on the lake, and your child goes to school, it means that morally you know there's something wrong with putting a child on the lake to work. So we can't stick to culture. There are some cultural practices that are not good. Why have we spoken against FGM, for instance? So we should
female
be able
genital mutilation.
Yes, female genital mutilation. So we should be able to speak against and take out of our heads, our minds, that this is something to train the child. You should listen to their stories. This has nothing to do with training. You cannot train a child like this. And so we should renew our minds, change our thinking or our thought patterns, and decide to care for the child. Think about it. It could be your child. It could be your child in that lake, diving in the middle of the night, closed eyes, and using their hands to find their way through into the lake to detangle or untangle the nets from the stumps. It could be your child, could be your niece or your nephew. It could be your niece or your nephew going through sexual abuse or physical abuse, emotional abuse. So we should just change our minds and decide to rescue these children from our minds. The rest would be easy to do if we have the resources to work.
Mrs. Rosa Frontier. I can't thank you enough for coming over, spending time with us, and educating us on what you do. Rosa is a social worker with International Justice Mission, and they have been on a mission to rescue children from the lake. You know, today it's all about safety and welfare of children on the Super Morning Show today. So, coming up, another conversation. The Education Minister, Matthew Opoku-Prempeh, has been speaking about a special committee set up under the office of the Senior Minister, which is going to ensure safe reopening of schools. We want to stress test these plans, so stay tuned, you don't want to miss it, and that is coming up in just a moment.
Me, I won't go central, I won't go leg, I won't go